It was a Sunday night in November 1875, and London was slowly disappearing. A thick yellow fog rolled in from the Thames, curling around gas lamps and dissolving the edges of buildings. Carriage wheels sounded distant and hollow, as if the city itself had sunk under water. In the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's and the grand dining rooms of Mayfair, the most powerful men on earth were finishing their dinners. Servants cleared plates, port was poured, cigars were lit. They spoke of familiar things: the price of coal, unrest in Ireland, the steady, confident expansion of the British Empire. It was the kind of evening that suggested permanence, the sense that the world was ordered, predictable, and firmly under control. But in a private room at 10 Downing Street, that certainty was unravelling. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was not eating. He was pacing, back and forth across the carpet, hands clasped behind his back, stopping occasionally to stare into the fire as, though answers might rise from the flames. In his hand was a telegram that had arrived less than an hour earlier. The paper was thin, the handwriting hurried, but the message it carried was heavy enough to make one of the most seasoned politicians in Britain feel exposed. It came from Cairo. Egypt was bankrupt, not strained, not temporarily embarrassed, bankrupt. The ruler of Egypt, the Khedive Ismail, was drowning in debt and facing humiliation, unrest, and the very real possibility of overthrow. And in his desperation, he was prepared to sell his most valuable possession, the Suez Canal. To understand why this single telegram turned a quiet Sunday into a moment of historic danger, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1875, and why a narrow strip of water carved through the desert had become the most important artery on Earth. This was the high tide of the Industrial Revolution. Steamships were no longer novelties. They were the backbone of global trade. Coal-powered engines moved goods, people, and armies at speeds unimaginable a generation earlier. Empires now depended on logistics as much as soldiers. Before the Suez Canal existed, Britain's connection to India was long and brutal. Ships had to sail south along the Atlantic, circle the entire African continent, round the Cape of Good Hope, and then push north into the Indian Ocean. The journey took months. It consumed enormous quantities of coal. It exposed crews to storms, disease, and shipwreck. India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, but it lay at the far end of a fragile supply chain. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it rewired the global system overnight. By slicing through the Isthmus of Suez, the canal linked the Mediterranean directly to the Red Sea. The distance between London and Bombay was nearly cut in half. Trade accelerated. Military response times collapsed. Control of the canal meant control of imperial circulation. For Britain, the canal was not just infrastructure, it was survival. If the canal closed, British trade would cease. If a hostile power controlled it, Britain could be strangled without firing a single shot. And yet, Britain didn't own it. In fact, Britain had once despised the canal. When the project was first proposed, British engineers dismissed it as impractical. Politicians denounced it as a French geopolitical trap designed to undermine British naval supremacy. The canal, they warned, would place Britain's lifeline to India in foreign hands. In that, they were correct. The canal was built by a French consortium and controlled by a French company. French investors held the majority of shares. The rest belonged to the ruler of Egypt. British ships passed through the canal daily. British wealth depended on it. British power flowed through it. But legally, it was not British. For years, London watched uneasily as French flags flew over the most important waterway on the planet. Access was tolerated. Control was postponed. Until now, the man offering the canal shares for sale was Ismail Pasha, the Khedive of Egypt, a ruler driven by ambition and undone by excess. When Ismail came to power, he looked at Cairo and saw backwardness, dusty streets, crumbling infrastructure, a nation caught between Ottoman decline and European dominance. He wanted transformation, fast. "My country is no longer in Africa," he declared. "We are now part of Europe." And he spent money as if belief alone could make it true. Under Ismail, Cairo became a construction site for modernity. Boulevards were carved through ancient neighborhoods. Opera houses rose where markets once stood. Railways and telegraph lines stretched across the desert. European architects and engineers flooded in. When the Suez Canal opened, Ismail staged a celebration of almost surreal extravagance. A road was built from the pyramids to the palace, so visiting royalty would not be inconvenienced by dust. Champagne flowed. Jewels were handed out like trinkets. The event was designed to announce Egypt's arrival among the great powers of Europe. But beneath the spectacle was rot. Ismail did not have the money. During the American Civil War, Egypt had enjoyed a brief golden age. With American cotton exports disrupted, Egyptian cotton prices soared. Ismail assumed the boom would last indefinitely. He borrowed heavily, convinced future profits would erase present debts. Then the war ended. American cotton returned to the market. Prices collapsed. Egypt's income vanished almost overnight. The spending did not stop. Ismail borrowed again, and again. Interest rates climbed relentlessly. European bankers knew Egypt was heading toward disaster, but the returns were irresistible. They lent anyway. By the mid-1870s, Egypt's entire national income was being consumed by debt repayments. Soldiers went unpaid. Teachers went unpaid. Peasants were crushed under rising taxes imposed to feed distant creditors. The state was bleeding itself dry. Now a massive payment was due. The treasury was empty. The army was restless. Ismail faced not only disgrace, but the risk of rebellion. He had one asset left, 44% of the Suez Canal Company, the family silver. Quietly, discreetly, Ismail let it be known that he was willing to sell his shares for £4 million. It was a desperate move, but it was his only lifeline. To the French government, the news was intoxicating. If France bought the shares, it would effectively dominate the canal. The Mediterranean would tilt decisively toward Paris. Britain's route to India would lie under foreign influence. French officials moved quickly. Contracts were prepared. Cash was ready. History, however, rarely turns on grand plans. Sometimes it turns on gossip. At a London dinner party, a journalist overheard a rumor. He sensed its significance and rushed it to the Foreign Office. The information moved rapidly through the bureaucracy until it reached the Prime Minister himself. That is how the telegram ended up in Disraeli's hand. He understood the stakes instantly. This was not merely a financial transaction. It was a geopolitical moment that would not repeat. If Britain bought the shares, the route to India would be secured for generations. A French project would become a British asset. It would be the boldest diplomatic maneuver of the century. But there was a problem so severe it bordered on the absurd. Ismail needed the money immediately, £4 million, within days. And Parliament was not in session. Parliament was in recess. That single fact transformed opportunity into crisis. Under British law, the government could not spend public money without parliamentary approval. Not a shilling. Not a penny. The Treasury was locked behind procedure, precedent, and debate. If Disraeli waited for Parliament to reconvene, weeks would pass. By then, Egypt would default, or France would already own the canal. France had no such obstacle. The French government did not need to wait for votes or committees. They had the cash ready. Contracts were already being drafted. In Paris, officials spoke confidently about completing the purchase within days. Disraeli understood the danger with brutal clarity. Britain did not need to lose a war to lose the canal. It only needed to hesitate. He sat alone in his office, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant hush of the fog outside. At 70 years old, he had spent his life climbing toward power. Outsider, novelist, dandy, Jew in a Protestant elite. He had survived ridicule, betrayal, and relentless political combat. But nothing in his career compared to this moment. If he acted without authority and failed, his career would end in disgrace. He could be impeached. He might even face prison for misuse of public funds. The scandal would destroy his government and stain the empire's reputation. If he did nothing, Britain would wake up to find the key to India in foreign hands. Disraeli had a rival who embodied the opposite instinct. William Gladstone, the moral conscience of Victorian politics, believed empire should be restrained, economical, and righteous. Gladstone would have recoiled at the idea of secretly spending £4 million on a foreign gamble. He would have insisted on debate, on procedure, on caution. Disraeli believed history did not wait for caution. He believed it rewarded nerve. He summoned his private secretary, Montague Corey, a young man whose loyalty to Disraeli bordered on devotion. When Corey entered the room, he sensed immediately that something extraordinary was unfolding. Disraeli asked him a question that sounded almost absurd. "Where," he said calmly, "can we find £4 million by Tuesday?" Corey did not laugh. He knew the Prime Minister was deadly serious. They went through the obvious options first. The Bank of England was dismissed almost immediately. The governor was cautious to the point of paralysis. He was bound by strict rules and traditions. He would demand parliamentary approval, paperwork, time. Time was the one thing Disraeli did not have. Disraeli needed money that could move instantly, quietly, without questions. He needed someone with vast liquidity and personal trust. Someone who understood that this was not merely a financial transaction, but a geopolitical strike. There was only one name that fit: the Rothschilds. The House of Rothschild was not just wealthy, it was omnipresent. With branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt, the family could mobilize gold and credit across Europe faster than governments could convene cabinets. They had financed wars, railways, and monarchs. They had outlasted empires. The head of the London branch, Lionel de Rothschild, was not merely a banker. He was a personal friend of Disraeli. Both men shared a quiet understanding of what it meant to rise in a society that never fully accepted them. Disraeli had been born Jewish and baptized as a child. Rothschild was the first practicing Jew to sit in Parliament after decades of exclusion. They trusted each other in ways few men did. Disraeli made his decision. He gave Corey precise instructions. Go to New Court, ask Lionel de Rothschild for £4 million, offer the British government as security. Corey hesitated for just a moment. "What security should I offer?" he asked. Disraeli did not blink. "Tell him," he said, "that the security is the British government." It was an astonishing bluff. Disraeli did not have parliamentary approval. He did not even have legal authority to make the offer. If Parliament later refused to ratify the purchase, Disraeli would be ruined. Rothschild would lose millions. The government would collapse under scandal. But Disraeli understood something fundamental. Empires are not built on legality alone. They are built on risk. Corey pulled on his coat and stepped into the fog. He hailed a carriage and gave the driver an address in the City of London. As the carriage rattled through narrow streets lit by flickering gas lamps, Corrie understood that he was carrying more than a message. He was carrying the fate of Britain's empire. At the same time, thousands of miles away, Ismail Pasha paced the halls of his palace in Cairo. French agents surrounded him daily, pressing contracts into his hands. They told him the British were too slow, that Parliament would never approve, that France was his only realistic option. Ismail stalled. He preferred Britain to France, but preference meant nothing without money. His debts were coming due. His authority was crumbling. If the British did not act within hours, he would sign with Paris. The clock was relentless. Corrie arrived at New Court, the headquarters of the Rothschild banking dynasty. It was not a typical bank. It was a fortress of finance, discreet, imposing, radiating quiet power. He was ushered into a private room where Lionel de Rothschild waited. The story of what happened next has been retold in many forms, but its essence remains one of the most cinematic moments in financial history. Rothschild was eating grapes. He did not look up as Corrie entered. He continued to eat slowly, methodically, spitting the skins and seeds onto a plate. The atmosphere was calm, almost theatrical. Corrie stood there, his pulse pounding, aware that the balance of global power hung in the air between them. He delivered Disraeli's message, £4 million, immediately. Rothschild paused. "What security?" he asked. Corrie repeated the words exactly as instructed. "The British government." Rothschild took another grape, chewed, swallowed. Then he spoke. "You shall have it." That was it. No lawyers, no contracts, no committees, just a gentleman's agreement between the Prime Minister of the world's greatest empire and the head of the world's most powerful bank. Within hours, the Rothschild network sprang into motion. Gold and credit were mobilized across Europe. Accounts were adjusted, transfers prepared. The speed of the operation was unprecedented. Back at Downing Street, Disraeli waited. When Corrie returned with the news, Disraeli's composure finally cracked. He sat down at his desk and wrote to Queen Victoria with barely concealed triumph. "It is settled," he wrote. "You have it, madam." The French had been outmaneuvered. The canal shares were secured. The next day, the money reached Cairo. Ismail Pasha was saved, at least temporarily. He paid his most urgent debts and dismissed the French agents who had crowded his court. British officials moved quickly, seizing the physical share certificates and packing them into iron boxes. They were shipped to England aboard a warship. When the news broke, Britain erupted in excitement. Newspapers hailed Disraeli as a genius. The boldness of the move captured the public imagination. It was framed as a bloodless victory, a triumph of nerve and intellect over foreign rivals. Even Gladstone, Disraeli's fiercest opponent, could see which way public opinion was leaning. But beneath the celebration, something darker was already taking shape. Because the £4 million had solved nothing, the £4 million arrived in Cairo with dramatic speed. For a brief moment, Ismail Pasha breathed again. Creditors were paid. Immediate humiliation was postponed. The palace lights stayed on. But the relief was an illusion. Ismail's debts were not a wound that could be stitched closed with a single payment. They were a disease that had already spread through the entire body of the Egyptian state. The money vanished almost as soon as it arrived, swallowed by interest payments and overdue obligations. Within months, Egypt was bankrupt again. Only this time, the situation had changed in a way that could not be undone. Before the sale, Britain had been a distant observer of Egypt's financial collapse. Now it was a shareholder, a creditor, a stakeholder. Britain owned nearly half of the Suez Canal. That single fact transformed Egypt's internal problems into British national interests. When Ismail announced in 1876 that Egypt could no longer meet its debt obligations, London could not simply shrug and look away. This was no longer a private dispute between an irresponsible ruler and European bankers. Britain's money was now on the line. Britain's route to India was now tied to Egypt's stability. Intervention became inevitable. British and French officials arrived in Cairo to investigate Egypt's finances. What they uncovered was staggering. The books were chaos, overlapping loans, inflated contracts, kickbacks and corruption on a scale that shocked even seasoned European financiers. Money had been borrowed, spent, borrowed again, and spent again, with little oversight and no restraint. The conclusion was brutal and unanimous. Ismail could not be trusted with money. The solution imposed on Egypt was known as dual control. It was presented as a technical financial arrangement. In reality, it was the suspension of sovereignty. A British official was placed in charge of collecting Egypt's revenue. A French official was placed in charge of spending it. Nothing moved without European approval. Taxes were raised sharply. Spending was slashed. Army salaries were cut. Infrastructure projects were halted halfway through construction. Every policy was designed with a single priority: ensuring European creditors were paid. To European bankers, it was rational. To Egyptians, it was humiliation. Peasants were squeezed mercilessly. Taxes rose even as crops failed. Forced labor was reintroduced in some regions. Soldiers, unpaid and angry, saw foreign advisors dictating orders to their officers. Bureaucrats realized their country was no longer governed from Cairo, but from London and Paris. Resentment hardened into rage. Ismail himself became a liability. He was blamed for the chaos, despised by his own people, and increasingly viewed by European powers as an obstacle. In 1879, Britain and France pressured the Ottoman Sultan to remove him. Ismail was deposed and replaced by his son, Tawfiq, a ruler chosen not for strength or vision, but for obedience. Egypt had not been invaded. It had been repossessed. The British government reassured itself that this arrangement was temporary. Once Egypt's finances were stabilized, control could be relaxed. The canal would be safe. The debts would be serviced. Order would return. But nations do not accept the loss of dignity quietly. Among the ranks of the Egyptian army, anger simmered. Officers watched as foreign advisors treated them like clerks. Soldiers saw their pay reduced, while European bondholders were protected without compromise. The sense of betrayal was personal and visceral. Out of this resentment emerged a man who would change everything. Colonel Ahmed Urabi was not an aristocrat or a court insider. He was the son of a peasant. He had risen through the ranks of the army on merit and shared the grievances of ordinary Egyptians. To his fellow officers and soldiers, he spoke plainly and forcefully. Egypt, he said, was being bled dry. Egypt was being ruled by foreigners. Egypt belonged to Egyptians. The slogan spread quickly: Egypt for the Egyptians. Urabi did not begin as a revolutionary. He demanded reforms, an end to foreign control, fair treatment for Egyptian officers, limits on royal authority, and the creation of a representative assembly. But the very act of articulating these demands terrified European interests. To British officials, Urabi was not a nationalist. He was a threat. They did not fear democracy. They feared unpredictability. A nationalist government might refuse to honor debts. It might renegotiate canal access. It might use the canal as leverage. The City of London grew nervous. Bondholders whispered warnings. Newspapers spoke darkly of instability and danger. The canal, they insisted, was at risk. In 1881, Urabi and his supporters forced the Khedive to accept a new government that limited foreign influence. British and French diplomats protested furiously. Warships appeared offshore as precaution. Tension escalated rapidly. In 1882, violence erupted in Alexandria. Riots broke out. Europeans were attacked and killed. The chaos was real, but it was also useful. In London, it was seized upon as proof that Egypt was descending into anarchy. The British government now faced a decision. Ironically, it was led by William Gladstone, the same man who had condemned Disraeli's imperial recklessness. Gladstone was deeply uncomfortable with military intervention. He believed Britain should avoid conquest and govern by moral example, but he also understood the pressure he was under. The canal mattered. The bondholders mattered. The empire's credibility mattered. Reluctantly, he authorized action. The Royal Navy sailed into Alexandria harbor and opened fire. Fortifications were destroyed. Large sections of the city burned. Smoke rose over the Mediterranean as one of the great cities of the ancient world was battered into submission. British troops followed. They landed on Egyptian soil and marched inland toward Cairo. Urabi's forces mobilized, but they were poorly equipped and hastily trained. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, British troops launched a dawn attack that shattered the nationalist army in a matter of hours. Cairo fell. Urabi was captured, tried, and exiled. The nationalist movement was crushed. British officials announced that their mission was complete. Order had been restored. The Khedive's authority was secure. The occupation, they insisted, would be temporary. It was a lie they told themselves. British troops remained. Advisors entrenched. Themselves in every department of government. Financial oversight deepened into administrative control. Egypt became, in practice, a British protectorate. What had begun as a loan had ended as a conquest, and it all traced back to that Sunday night in London. Disraeli never lived to see this outcome. He died believing he had made a clever financial move that secured Britain's interests. He never watched British cavalry ride into Cairo. He never saw the nationalist leaders led away in chains. But his gamble had unleashed a chain reaction that could not be stopped. The Suez Canal became the obsession of British foreign policy. It dictated military planning, diplomatic alliances, and strategic decisions for decades to come. Britain now had to control Egypt, not because it wanted to, but because it could not afford not to. To protect the canal, Britain had to control the government. To control the government, it had to occupy the country. To secure the Nile, it would eventually push south into Sudan. Mission creep became destiny. What Disraeli bought with a checkbook was not just shares in a canal. It was responsibility for an entire region, whether Britain wanted it or not. And the consequences of that responsibility were only beginning to unfold. By the late 1880s, Britain no longer pretended that Egypt was independent. Officially, Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire. Officially, the Khedive still ruled. Officially, British troops were only advisors, maintaining order until stability returned. In reality, Egypt had become an occupied country. British officials controlled the budget, supervised ministries, and dictated policy. British generals commanded the army. British administrators rewrote tax systems and agricultural production. The decisions that mattered were no longer made in Cairo, but in London, often with the interests of bondholders weighing more heavily than those of Egyptians themselves. The Suez Canal sat at the center of everything. It was now guarded, fortified, and treated as an extension of Britain's imperial bloodstream. Every political calculation passed through it. Every diplomatic risk was measured against it. Britain's presence in Egypt was no longer a temporary inconvenience. It was a strategic necessity, and necessity has a way of expanding. To protect Egypt, Britain argued it had to secure the Nile. To secure the Nile, it had to control Sudan. To control Sudan, it had to fight wars far from home, in landscapes few British citizens could even imagine. What began as a financial transaction metastasized into a regional empire. This was not how Britain had once preferred to rule. For much of the 19th century, British leaders prided themselves on what they called the imperialism of free trade. They preferred markets to mandates, influence to occupation. They sold goods, controlled shipping lanes, and let local rulers govern, so long as British interests were respected. Egypt changed that model. Debt altered the equation. Once Britain became Egypt's creditor, neutrality became impossible. A default threatened British investors. Instability threatened the canal. Nationalism threatened both. Each crisis justified deeper involvement, tighter control, heavier boots on the ground. By the turn of the 20th century, Egypt was effectively run by British civil servants who answered not to Egyptians, but to the Treasury and Parliament. And the consequences didn't end there. The Suez Canal became the cornerstone of Britain's global strategy. During the First World War, it was treated as a prize that could not be lost under any circumstances. British troops defended it fiercely against Ottoman attacks. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain reshaped the Middle East with one overriding priority: keep the canal safe. Promises made to Arab leaders during the war were quietly broken. Borders were drawn with rulers and straight lines, not cultures or histories in mind. Mandates were imposed, friendly monarchs were installed, unfriendly movements were suppressed. Again and again, the logic returned to the same point. Nothing must endanger Suez. The irony was that Disraeli, the architect of the canal purchase, never saw this world take shape. He died in 1881, before British troops marched into Cairo, before nationalism ignited across the region, before the Middle East became a permanent arena of imperial anxiety. He believed he had made a brilliant, bloodless move, a financial maneuver that secured Britain's future without war. In a narrow sense, he was right. Britain did not lose India because of the canal. British trade flowed faster than ever. The empire entered the 20th century seemingly secure. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The purchase of the Suez Canal marked a turning point in how power operated. It demonstrated that sovereignty could be hollowed out not by invasion, but by debt. That nations could be controlled not by conquest, but by balance sheets. That a ruler's desperation could redraw the fate of entire regions. For Egypt, the cost was enormous. A generation grew up under foreign occupation. Economic decisions were made to satisfy creditors, not citizens. Political reform was delayed, distorted, and suppressed. Nationalist movements learned that peaceful demands could be ignored, but force would be met with overwhelming violence. The memory did not fade. When Egyptians later demanded independence, they remembered Alexandria burning. They remembered how a loan had turned into an occupation. They remembered that foreign powers spoke the language of order while practicing control. Even after Britain formally ended its occupation in the mid-20th century, the shadow of Suez remained. In 1956, when Egypt finally attempted to reclaim the canal outright, Britain reacted not with diplomacy, but with force, only to discover that the age of empire had passed, and the world would no longer tolerate it. That crisis marked Britain's final reckoning as a global imperial power, and it all traced back to one night. A foggy Sunday in November 1875, a desperate ruler in Cairo, a prime minister pacing in London, a banker eating grapes. No armies moved that night. No shots were fired. No flags were lowered. But the modern Middle East began to take shape. The Suez Canal purchase teaches a lesson that remains uncomfortably relevant. Debt is never neutral. It carries power, leverage, and consequence. Those who control credit often control outcomes long before soldiers arrive. Empires may still speak the language of stability and order. They may insist their actions are temporary, reluctant, necessary. But history shows that once influence is purchased, withdrawal becomes almost impossible. The British did not conquer Egypt in 1875. They bought it. And the bill, paid in sovereignty, resentment, and instability, echoed for generations. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers. And on that night, in the fog of London, history quietly changed direction, signed not with a treaty, but with a loan.